Um, it's it's an interesting passage, isn't it? I don't know what people thought as they were reading through, perhaps for the first time. Perhaps you've read it many times before. But yeah, it's a bit fiddly. But we'll see what we make of it and see where we come out by the end of this. So this, as Robin said, is our series on the second half of Daniel, so chapters 7 to 12, and about kingdom vision, kings, kingdoms, and the kingdom of heaven. And the title that was assigned, gone too far ahead, is the bad news and the good news. That was on the kind of what was on the preaching rota. And I don't know about you, but if you're just listening to that passage, you might have spotted quite a lot of bad news. I don't know whether you immediately spotted any good news in there, but hopefully we'll get there. It's a weird passage because it seems to be all about, and it's very historically rooted, and we'll talk about some of that. You know, this northern kingdom and this southern kingdom just fighting each other all the time, relentlessly, back and forwards, north against south, south against north, north against south. Then they get married, then something goes wrong, then they fight each other, then someone else comes in. It's just this circle of seemingly violence and chaos, and not really easy to work out what the point is behind all of this. What is actually going on, and what can we take from it? It's seemingly quite a heavy passage. And it got me thinking a bit about futility. And, things which just seem a bit pointlessness. And I found some cracking examples online just to kind of introduce a bit of levity before we get into the meat and seriousness of this. So I don't know if people have any examples of their own. But sorry, before on that, I was just say this quote from Winston Churchill seemed quite apposite with some of this. Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. This idea of cycles of things just happening over and over again. Anyway, back to the jokes and the levity. Futility and pointlessness. This one I really enjoyed. So there's a lady here, clearly tears streaming down her face. Must be a Spanish TV program. Someone's wonderfully put subtitles in for us and has informed us not only that she's crying, as if we couldn't have worked that out for ourselves, but she's crying in Spanish. So that's a particularly helpful insight, I'm sure you'll agree. On our run-through of seemingly slightly pointless and circular things, I think it'd be a little bit difficult to sit down in this chair. I don't know if anyone else quite knows what we would do with this chair. It kind of got that slight feeling as if someone had one left over and they had to put it somewhere. But whether it actually functions as a chair as such, I mean, and it's this bar as well, which means you can't even sit kind of side saddle on it. So it's a whole new level of difficulty. And then I think I've got one more. Yeah, this one. This I also really appreciated, the idea that someone would go to the trouble of putting up a sign in order to tell you to ignore that sign. So, but very grateful for the input of the people who put those together. Anyway, sorry. Back to Daniel, shall we? So we're looking at, or we've been looking at Daniel 7 to 12 in the current series. So chapter 7 all the way through to 12, and today we hit chapter 11. So there's only one more to go after this. And it might feel like the series has been going on for a while, and that's because it's been interspersed with other series. So we've had the Jesus and Money series. We've recently had Easter as well, which lends itself to some good preaching topics. And now we're back in Daniel. And you might remember that we spoke about the first half of Daniel about 2 years ago. So during lockdown, in fact, I remember recording a sermon because I remember doing it in our front room on a Thursday afternoon, thinking I need to pretend it's Sunday morning, where you're trying to kind of put up this pretense, and then realizing after I'd filmed it there was a clock behind me, and so that had completely messed that up. And then every time you stop and then re-record, obviously the hands move. Anyway, it all looks a little bit disjointed. But Daniel chapters 1 to 6, as you might remember, are a whole load of stories, and some of them really quite famous stories and quite famous children's stories as well. So Daniel and the Lion's Den is probably the most famous, but there's also the fiery furnace as well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and people will remember the story with that. The second half of the book is really quite different. as you may have experienced already thinking about today's passage and the previous passages in this series. And they are what are known as apocalyptic visions. It's a particular style of writing. It's not one which I've really come across outside of the Bible, and particularly Daniel, which is kind of the best example in the Bible of apocalyptic visions. And Robin spoke a bit about an apocalypse and what it is, I think, in the first sermon in the series, but that was a while ago, so let me just give you a little bit of a reminder on that. And read a definition, and I think it's quite a helpful definition. So an apocalypse is intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in the light of the supernatural world and of the future, and to influence both the understanding and behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. I'll read it again, and perhaps slightly slower. So an apocalypse is intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in light of the supernatural world and of the future, and to influence both the understanding and the behavior of the audience by the means of divine authority. So it has this sense of peeling back what we know and what we can see and what we've experienced, and trying to find the deeper reality which is in there, give us a fresh perspective on what's going on, with the aim that it changes us, that changes our behavior, it changes our view, it changes our understanding of what's going on. And so as we said, so Daniel 1-6 is these stories. It's about stories about living life, particularly living life under in exile and under occupation. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the back end of Daniel are these apocalypses. So this idea of looking at events but trying to give us a new angle on them, a fresh perspective that we can take away. But before we delve into the detail of today's passage, let's just zoom out a bit, and hopefully by the end of the preach you'll work out why I've done this. So the Bible, as we know, is one book. I saw a few people, obviously people reading had them. We don't tend to have print Bibles so much anymore, so maybe that idea doesn't come to us quite so readily, but it's one book. You know, it comes in one volume, and it's a story, and it's a very, very long story spread across lots of different parts, lots of different sections, written at different times, different authors, etc., but it forms one unified story. And in the same way that you wouldn't pick up a 500 or 600 page novel, flick open page 267, read 2 paragraphs and say, okay, now I know what this book is saying about X topic or Y topic. You wouldn't do that or shouldn't do that with the Bible either. You want to take the passage that you're reading and you want to put it in its proper place within its book, the book within, the section that it's in, within its style of writing, within its historical context, and within the flow of the Bible story. And the sweep of the Bible story is probably well known to a lot of us, but let's just canter through it quickly. So this idea that God creates a good world. Remember, he blesses creation. He looks at everything he makes, he says it's good, and then in fact he looks at the likes of you and I and says that's very good. Then humans mess it up. And God calls a man in the form of Abram, later Abraham, and a people, his family, Israel, to live distinctively. He calls them out, live distinctively, live differently, redeem, bless the world. He makes big promises to them and through them. And it's fair to say the results are a bit mixed, if you've read the Old Testament. There are some good bits, but there's quite a lot of unfaithfulness from God's chosen people. God's faithfulness is consistent. That's the bit that keeps going. But the unfaithfulness from his people is there, and the story tells us that leads to consequences, things like exile, occupation, but the promises still remain. And then, of course, God sends Jesus, and we've celebrated that most recently last week at Easter, but as Jane prayed earlier, every Sunday is Resurrection Day. We really celebrate it every week, but Easter is kind of our big festival for that. And obviously, Jesus, through his life and through what we read in the Gospels, gives us this picture of what God is like. We see God incarnate in the flesh. We see what he's capable of, what he does, how he lives his life. And through his death and resurrection, we get forgiveness of sin, we get redemption, we get reconciliation, we get new life, and we get the ushering in of the kingdom in this now but not yet way, if people are familiar with that phrase. The idea that the kingdom is breaking in, but we haven't seen all of it yet. We almost see glimpses of it. We want to see a lot more of it. We want to see loads and loads of those glimpses, but we just see aspects, and we're not going to see all of it until Christ comes again, but we want to see increasingly more up until that happens. And in that story, that story I've just described, we obviously live towards the end of that narrative, the end of that story. Daniel is written for people originally who are more in the middle of that story, particularly living lives of exile or living under occupation, foreign military powers, and we saw loads of that, north, south, etc., and we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But Daniel, consequently, has been a tremendous help and encouragement to countless generations of Christians and Jewish people who found themselves in difficult circumstances, perhaps literally under occupation, perhaps literally in exile, or perhaps other aspects of life which feel like that. Interestingly, I read as I was looking into this, Daniel was banned at one stage in Korea. So in the Second World War, Japan invaded Korea, and the Koreans lived under occupation. And they banned 2 books of the Bible, and one was Daniel, the Japanese occupiers, clearly realizing just how powerful this story is. Anyone want to guess what the other one was while we're on it? Well, Exodus. Also an escape from occupation and exile. But such powerful stories within the Bible story, which have real-world consequences. So let's now go to chapter 11. I should say in advance, I'm not going to go through every verse like this. I'm not going to kind of decode every verse as we go. We'll be here all day, and you may or may not find that helpful. But I will do some of it because I think it puts it into real-world events, and you can really see what it's aimed at and what's going on here. So let's start with a bit of broader historical content, and the history lesson will also be brief for people who don't like that. For the people who do, sorry, it's going to be brief. So let's start with the United Jewish Kingdom. The idea of a United Jewish Kingdom was pretty short-lived. It lasted for 200 years, 1200 to 1000 BC. Okay? Then that split. The northern kingdom, the northern bit of the Jewish kingdom, broke away and said, we're going on our own, 922 BC. 200 years after that, the Assyrians turn up and take it. So they take that bit, they are conquered. 150 years after that, the southern bit gets taken too, not by the Assyrians, but by the Babylonians. So you had a united Jewish kingdom. The northern bit splits off, the Assyrians come and take that. The southern bit is left behind, the Babylonians come and take that. And both communities, the north and the south community, experience something quite similar, military conquest and deportation. So it tended to be the educated people and people like Daniel, who we read about, who get shipped off to the capital, get shipped off to the colonial headquarters, and other people get left behind to live under occupation. And what Daniel 1-6 is all about in that context is how can we remain faithful in a foreign land? We're being put under pressure by its culture, by its learning, by its expectations. How can we literally keep the faith in those circumstances? And what we see in the first 6 chapters of Daniel is all kinds of stories of where they've chosen to be different and live differently and live distinctively, and it has spectacularly positive results. They achieve more than the Babylonian wisdom and the Babylonian expertise by sticking to their guns. So, this particular passage. So we've talked about the Assyrians taking the top bit, the Babylonians taking the bottom bit. The Babylonians then get taken over by the Medo-Persians. The Persians are then defeated by Alexander the Great. Alexander's kingdom then gets split up. And then we end up with this chap, Antiochus Epiphanes, who, despite having a great name, is also a significant feature and figure, particularly in Jewish history and in Jewish thinking. To give you an idea of what he's thought of, what people think of him, his nickname was Harasha, meaning the wicked. So that gives you a rough idea of what's going on and how they see him. He is a major villain, Antiochus Epiphanes. He's around 167 BC. And famously, he banned the practice of the Jewish faith in the temple and set up his own religion there, which is what we talked about or read earlier with the abomination that brings desolation. That's what's going on there. So that's the broad historical context. Let's zoom in now specifically on our passage. So in our passage, Gabriel turns up to Daniel and he says, "I've got a revelation for you. Okay, I've got something to tell you. I've got a story to tell you." The next 45 verses are spent describing what is effectively centuries of conflict and war. And it's very interesting, Daniel 11, because Daniel 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12, there's quite a lot of controversy over what's going on there. Loads of theories about what might be happening. Daniel 11 is actually relatively straightforward from that perspective. There's a huge amount of agreement as to what's being described and what's going on here for theologians from across the spectrum. And someone described it as lightly disguised and easily decoded. So I'm sure you found it very easily to decode it as well when you were reading it. But for anyone who wants to work through it a little bit, I will humour you. So verses 1 to 4 are talking about these Persian rulers. Verses 5 to 35 are going from Alexander to this chap Antiochus Epiphanes, and then there's just a few verses at the end of the chapter. So the first couple of verses are talking about guys, Cyrus, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and then in verse 3 we read, "Then a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases." That's Alexander the Great. That's who they're talking about. I think Robin mentioned Alexander as well when he opened up the series. Via Hannibal and elephants, yeah. I wasn't going to say that, but anyway, someone else brought it up. But Alexander the Great was the guy who basically conquered the known world, and I think at the age of 32, 33 was said to have cried because there were no more worlds to conquer. He'd done it. He'd done the whole thing. He'd got the lot. And then what happens to him? He dies. He dies suddenly. Historians think genuinely that he had quite a large night out, had a fever, and then died quite soon afterwards. But the consequence of him dying suddenly was there was no succession plan in place. They hadn't decided who was going to take what. He didn't have a designated successor to take the whole lot. So as we'll see here, after he is arisen, his empire will be broken up and parcelled out toward the four winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. And this is describing the jostling for position between his generals. And ultimately, 4 of them won out, and they agreed to parcel his kingdom, or his empire, into 4 separate regions. It wasn't neat north, south, east, west, but broadly 4 areas. And this idea of it kind of being dispersed to the 4 winds, and that he didn't get his own descendant to take over. It was it happened in a much more a much less organised way, let's say. So they were jostling for position, and then we get into the real meat of it, and we go from 5 to 35. And I say I'm not going to go through it beyond these 2 verses. Don't worry if you're getting a bit tired of the history. But what we've got here is we start to read a lot about the king of the south and the king of the north. In some translations, it just says northern king, southern king. And this is describing a 200-year period. So actually, it's not describing one king the whole time, one king of the north or one king of the south. It's using the word king of the north or king of the south to describe whoever's in charge at that time in the south, and king of the north, whoever is in charge at that time in the north. So the north were the Seleucids, Seleucus 1 to 4, and Antiochus 1 to 4. We heard about Antiochus. And the south is the Egyptian monarch of the day. That's Ptolemy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, depending on what's going on. But the idea of using this phrase, king of the south and king of the north, is to give this kind of a unified theme as a story. So you can follow through the story. And frankly, to a certain extent, give this kind of pointless feel to it. That whatever happens, new people come in, but it's the same story. the same battle, north to south, south to north, with, frankly, Judah, some of the Jewish people, caught in the middle. Final little decoding of this bit. So the king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she'll be betrayed, together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. What's going on with that? Well, Antiochus II and Ptolemy II get together and say, actually, we could become allies here. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to marry our families together. So Antiochus II and Ptolemy II agree that Antiochus will marry Ptolemy II's daughter, who's called Berenice. Slight hitch in the plan is that Antiochus was already married to a lady called Laodice, and in fact had 2 sons with her as well. So Antiochus had to divorce her, Laodice, to then go and marry Berenice. Had a son with Berenice, then decided, actually, I'm going to go back to the lady who I divorced first time round. She seemingly welcomes him back, but then does what? Poisons him, has Berenice killed, and her children as well. As you can see, the daughter will go to the north, make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he will not retain his, etc., etc. You can see how it all is in there. And then what happens after that? Well, Berenice's brother becomes Ptolemy III and attacks the northern kingdom in reprisal for what happened to Berenice. And frankly, I could go on. That's basically what is going on. And there's this story that there's always a bigger fish out there to take you. However powerful you think you might be, there's always someone else. So this whole chapter 11, there's an exercise of power, there's external conflict, there's internal dissolution, Alexander's generals. There's a more powerful enemy that comes in, the bigger fish. They try and get elusive final victory. They do marriage alliances. They don't work. They try to do it by force. That doesn't work either. They win famous victories, but they're temporary. It doesn't really get them anywhere. And then at the end of the chapter, when the final victory over north over south seems possible, another power comes in and stops them in their tracks. And you might think, how do we find meaning in all of this chaos? What's going on? And of course, the wars that we see described here are not just, exclusive to that time. I didn't know exactly what Robin was going to pray about earlier, but a lot of the names he mentioned are on my piece of paper here of ongoing conflicts. And the Ukraine we know most about because it's most recent and perhaps most close to home. But Afghanistan, last year in Afghanistan, apparently 31,000 people died in war. Ethiopia, 50,000 casualties ongoing. Mexico's drug wars in Mexico for years. 350,000 people, I think, have died as a result of drug wars in Mexico. The Yemen, 140,000 fatalities, and that war is ongoing. And we're faced with these cycles of violence all around, in history and today. Wars of conquest, people flexing their power, flexing their muscles. And of course, for us, it may not be quite so dramatic. It might not be that we have come from war, but I know some people have. For us, it might just feel a cycle of bad things happening in our lives, and the things that recurrent themes that come through our work or through our family or other contexts in which we operate. Things that live with us, which recur and impact us. So there was supposed to be some good news in all of this, as well as the bad news. And I think the good news, or part of the good news that we get from this passage, is right at the end. And it says, "Yet he will come to his end." All of this will end. It will end. And that was part of the purpose of going through the whole Bible story at the start. The people have gone through all kinds of difficulties and exile and occupation and all the rest of it, and we see glimpses of the kingdom. It hasn't come to an end fully yet, but it will come to an end. And that is our eternal hope when Jesus comes again, that it will come to an end. And there were kind of three things, if it comes up, that I wanted to take away from this. And they're confidence, faithfulness, and prayer. And confidence, by confidence I mean part of what we were just talking about, that we know that Christ will come again and there will be an end and the kingdom will come fully. And the glimpses we see of the kingdom will become something full and complete. And these cycles will finish. But also there's hope for now. There's hope for now that we can hold on to. In particular, the hope that we know that God can bring good things out of bad situations. A lot of this is driven by human ambition and human failings and bad decisions, and God miraculously is able to bring good things out of those places. And he's also, as Robin was sharing with us earlier, he sat in the boat with us. He's alongside us. Even, we were singing earlier, even if I don't feel it, you're working. Even if I don't see it, you're working. He is active. He is working. So confidence was the first thing for us to think about and hold on to. And the second one is faithfulness. And that's one of the consistent themes that runs all the way through Daniel. And that is that we should be living out this new reality, this new life, this new way of living, this new redeemed way of living that we've been called to. We should be living that out now, and we want to draw other people into that life too. And we want to reflect something of that new and coming kingdom in the life that we lead today, and live faithfully to the call, live faithfully to how we've been called to live by Christ and the example that he's given us and the sacrifice. And that's what we see in Daniel, as we were talking earlier on, 1-6, faithfully living out a completely different way of living and seeing God bless it and seeing God work through it. And then the final thing I want to talk about was prayer and a call to prayer and staying in Daniel and Daniel 9. I know this was a couple of sermons ago it was covered, but I just wanted to read a little portion of this long prayer in Daniel 9, starting at verse 17. And it's a prayer about sorrow, but also about hope, and asking God to intervene and for the kingdom to come in. He said, "Now, our God, hear the prayers and petitions of your servant. For your sake, Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, O our God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because we're righteous, but because of your great mercy. Lord, listen. Lord, forgive. Lord, hear and act for your sake, my God. Do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. Lord, bring rescue, bring healing, bring justice. We recognize our faults. If you read that passage, the prayer, the first bit of it is about all the stuff they've done wrong, but then saying, in spite of that, Lord, come and intervene. Come and bring in that ultimate future. We're going to move, I think, into bread and wine shortly and have the opportunity to maybe think about these things, and Robin's going to lead us in that. But I just wanted to highlight these points again. Confidence, the idea that there is going to be an end, but in the meantime, he's with us. There's a song I really like from a guy called Dave Crowder. I'm just going to read the lyrics quickly. It says, "Lord, I'm tired, so tired from walking, and Lord, I'm so alone. And Lord, the dark is creeping up to swallow me. I think I'll stop, rest here for a while. And didn't you see me crying? And didn't you hear me call your name? Wasn't it you I gave my heart to? I wish you'd remember where you sat it down." And he goes on to say, "I didn't notice you were standing here. I didn't know that you were holding me. I didn't notice that you were crying too. I didn't know that was you washing my feet." He's with us and he's alongside us, even if we haven't got our eyes open to see it. And that's the confidence, to say the faithfulness to live a new and different life. and then this idea of prayer, of recognizing sorrow and difficulty, but praying for justice, praying for intervention, praying for more of this now and not yet kingdom to come, and seeing more of the glimpses of the kingdom in places like the Ukraine, in places like Yemen, in places like Mexico, but also in our lives, our day-to-day lives, in our family situations, in our work situations, in our neighborhoods, in all the different mess of the world that we have to deal with, that we see the kingdom breaking in. Little patches of kingdom coming in, and that we're part of that as we live faithfully.